the founder of Hope Made Strong and the Church Mental Health Summit. Kimberly Britt works as executive director of Anchor International. And then, of course, you heard from Kay Warren as well. We know that Pastor Keon is a pastor, representing pastors here. I want a quick and an elevator speech from Kimberly Britt and Laura Howe on what your ministries do. So let's start with you, Kimberly. Tell us about Anchor International and your passion behind it.
Yes, Anchor International, we are a nonprofit ministry organization, and we help equip the church to support mental wellness in congregations and other faith communities, even faith-based schools. And we do this by training peer leaders to run peer support groups within their communities, and we also provide additional training for everyone within the church.
Thank you. And Laura Howe, our Canadian on the panel, which I learned this morning. Any Canadians in the house? No, just you.
Okay, I'll represent well.
Tell us about...
Philip, I see you, Philip. Okay.
Tell us about Hope Made Strong.
Hope Made Strong is an organization that is passionate about coming alongside your church to help develop care ministries that don't burn out your teams and support your people to create communities of belonging, purpose, and hope. And we do that through podcasts, on blogs, downloadables, training, resources. Also, we're passionate about highlighting amazing tools and resources that are out there. There's many of you in this audience who've been speakers at the Church Mental Health Summit, and so we really want to highlight the amazing work that is being done in this space through that event.
So let's go around the panel here, and I want to let's start positive. What is the church doing well in ministry with individuals and families impacted by mental illness? Let's start with Kay.
Doing well. Well, some of the things that I just talked about are happening. You know, there are an increasing number of churches who are taking this call seriously and are seeking training. I think there's almost a proliferation in the last few years of organizations like Laura's and like Kimberly, right? Sorry. Sorry to call you Britt, sorry. And others, Sanctuary, Soul Shop. There's some great organizations that are offering training, Living Works, offering suicide prevention training to churches, and churches are seeking that out. So I love that. I think there is just even that recognition, just the acknowledgement that mental illness is real has taken some of the suffering down, in churches where people don't feel as much the need to hide, what they're dealing with, because there is a lessening, of some of that stigma. So I'll just stop right there, but I think those are two really powerful things that I've seen a shift in.
Wonderful, thank you. Pastor Keon, what's the church doing well in caring for members with mental health struggles?
Yeah, I think that's awesome.
Perfect timing.
Ooh.
I think changing our theology around mental illness, and several of us grew up in contexts where mental illness was connected to sin.
Right.
And you could pray your kid out of it, essentially, or you pray your spouse out of it. And I think now that we have become more normalized and accepting it, we're not treating it like this sin that needs to be repented of or dealt with, but more of a way that God has uniquely granted us an opportunity to redeem His creation. And I think that's one critical step that I'm seeing in the church. Universal, that our construct is changing. Pastors are being open and honest about mental health and being neurodiverse and all that kind of stuff, and that's been very encouraging to the rest of the body.
Laura, how? What about you? What's the church doing well in caring for our people with mental health struggles?
This might be a little bit left field, but I think we're really, really good at gathering together. Not so great on talking with one another, but really good at gathering together. And I think that is a key part of caring. When someone's suffering or struggling, they often feel alone and isolated. And a huge part is just coming together and being with one another. So I think that first step of gathering or being with someone, we do well. And I'll leave it there. We could talk about the next step that we might not be so good at, but we are really good at gathering.
Okay. Kimberly Britt, what are we doing well?
I think what we are doing really well is realizing as a church, for the most part, that mental health, it's a real thing, and we want to do something about it, and we're starting to collaborate and reach out and realizing we can't do this alone. It was like Kay was talking about, a decade ago, we were kind of more in a space of, oh, mental health's not really real, or, you just need to pray more, have more faith. It was spiritual shortcomings. And that's about when we were founded in 2011, and I've seen a shift since then. It's like my good friend Brandon Applehan says, it's a slow turning ship, but we're seeing it move from, okay, this is real, and okay, we do need to do something about it, and we don't know how to do something about it, and so now we're reaching out. So I think we're getting a little better at collaborating, reaching out to other parachurch organizations, training organizations to help with the church.
Now we'll start with you and go back around. Kimberly, where are we most falling short as a church in caring for those with mental health struggles?
Well, kind of like what I was saying, what we're doing well is that we are realizing we can't do this on our own. And I would say, I don't want to sit up here and beat up the church, but maybe what we're not doing so great is thinking we can do it on our own, and churches kind of siloing off and thinking they can solve this issue on their own and developing more programs within the church. I've seen this more with larger congregations where they want to kind of develop their own program, develop their own training, when there's so many incredible organizations out there. I mean, we're all partners in ministry. And there's so many great organizations here that do, support groups or trainings, suicide intervention, crisis intervention. And so I think that's maybe what we're not doing so great.
Very good. What about you, Laura Howe? What's your take on that?
So to follow up, we're really great at gathering, but we're not really great at talking about our weaknesses. I grew up in a church where it was like, you're blessed to be a blessing, and so blessed to be stressed, I think is the example.
Too blessed to be stressed.
You're too blessed to be stressed, absolutely. If I'm above ground, I'm having the best day of my life. So, all of these things, we have a hard time sharing our weaknesses. And as human beings, we are all weak and we all have struggle. And so I think the vulnerability factor and the fear that comes with being vulnerable is something that we all, as humans, struggle. And as leaders of organizations and as leaders of church, it just amplify that struggle and the challenge of being vulnerable. Multiply that. And so I think when we admit that we are not superhumans and, we're not God himself, then I think that's where we have room. We can gather, but we need to admit and see where we are weak.
Pastor Keon Abner, what's your take as a clergy member here? Where are we most falling short?
I think similar to the same thing that Laura said, is that vulnerability. I think similar to that is just the pride and the selfishness of how we do church and how church feels to us, not wanting to risk that to reach someone else. And I think a lot of us, we treat mental health issues like it is a very small population of our churches. When I was making this joke about our church's kids ministry. We don't need a special needs ministry. We need a neurotypical ministry for the 3 or 4 kids that they need a support group. And I think, like the other piece of the puzzle is recognizing that it's more among us than you think, and it's more of an issue for us all to be grappling with. It's not just that family or that person with the clear, obvious thing. It's like, no, haven't you realized that the last 4 conflicts you've had with that person has ended in a weird way, that there could be something there? And I think that's just a piece of the puzzle for us, is like, let's humble ourselves to realize that this is a bigger issue that affects more of us than we think. And that should bring it up in the priority level of how we deal with it versus treating it like we've got a couple of members who need help in this area.
Yeah. True.
Kay Warren, what's your take on why, like the area where we're most falling short in this?
Well, as much as I think we're doing well, as I said in the very beginning, I think we're still really falling short. I think one of the slides that Dr. Gershovitz showed of the number of people with disabilities, or mental health sickness, who the likelihood that you're not going to be in church, those children are not going to be in church. So I think while we're patting ourselves on the back and thinking we're doing a great job, I actually think from the experience, my own experience, I talk to mothers all the time, and they tell a different story. Many of them do not feel supported. Many of them do not feel like their church understands. Many of them do not feel like their church is accommodating for their child. Many of them do not feel that they are welcomed in typical, like a women's Bible. Let me just give you from a women's Bible study perspective. When my son was doing really poorly, and I would come to our women's Bible study, and I would sit there, and there would be, everybody's doing their sharing, and I would usually try to go to the bathroom during that time because it was so painful to have all the other mothers, oh, my kid just won this scholarship, oh, my kid just got awarded this, oh, their team just did this, their team just won that. They're rightfully, joyfully sharing their children's accomplishments. But what I could share that day was, my kid kicked a hole in the wall last night and said he wanted to die. Yeah. Well, you throw that out into the sharing, and there's this paralyzing silence that comes over unless you're with really deep friendships. And people don't know what to do with that. And so then they're either like, there's this uncomfortable silence. I'm just saying that's really the more common experience.
Yeah.
And I'm so with you on that. My family's experienced the same thing because we know the other women in that room were dealing with struggles. They were just hiding them. And I'm trying to figure out, because I stand with all of you in the idea that vulnerability is key for us to be able to break down some of these barriers. What is keeping us as Christians who believe in the sinful nature of man and that we all fall short of God's glory? What keeps us from being honest about our struggles in the American church today? Whoever wants it, go for it.
Doesn't fit the American dream.
Yeah, I think the culture of American Christianity teaches us to be silent about our sin and die in silence because I think the way we deal with sin in the church is sin bad, Jesus good, details inside the Bible, versus saying, how do we actually usher people through transformation in their lives, and how do we have a culture of brokenness that allows us to all be okay with the fact that our people are broken? And I think that does start with pastors. If a pastor pastors a church for 15 years and never has a moment of confession, never have a moment where he says to the church, this is something that I've struggled with, that I have put to death in Christ, and this is the journey that I have taken to do that, even as a leader, we just don't have that culture. Most pastors fear that they'll lose credibility or be fired if they share the things that they struggle with, which, don't get me wrong, if certain things you share, you should get fired. But I think the idea is that we have a culture that is not okay with brokenness. And Tyler, forget his last name, at Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon, he wrote a book, Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools. And he said in the book, I used to think that the holier a church got, the less sin there would be to confess. And he says, what I've learned is that the holier a church gets, is not that it's less sins to confess, but less secrets to conceal. And I think that's why we don't share. That's why we don't talk about what's really happening, is because we have a culture that wants to condemn sin and then diagnose behavior versus recognizing that we're all broken and that in order for us to be healed, we need to have a space where we can confess, be prayed for, and people can walk us toward that.
I also think people struggle to live in the gray. It is way easier to have black or white thinking, all or nothing, good and bad, left or right. It feels good to have company in one position. And when it comes to vulnerability and sharing, it is a both and. You are both struggling and you are saved by grace. We live in a gray world where there's both and. You can have a bad day, but yet still have the joy of the Lord. And it's hard to put that and to live in that and have that framework in, day in and day out. And so we pick a side, and the popular side is when you're good, and that's the Instagram side, and that's when people rejoice with you. It is hard, and so it's hard for us as humans, myself included, everyone in this room, to live in the gray, to be both and. And I think that is an amazing opportunity to extend grace, that someone can struggle, someone can be lamenting and sorrowful and in the depths of despair, and yet they are still children of God, and yet they're still my friend, and yet they're still saved by grace. And so having both and is hard.
I would say for me personally, sometimes fear will keep me from holding back, because I'm afraid, I'll say something like, how am I really doing? And it's just going to fall flat. Or I'm going to see a look on somebody's face like, I don't know what to do with that. Or they don't have the time for me. And there's nothing worse than sharing something and being really vulnerable about something you're going through. It's really scary, and then you say it out loud, and it just like falls on the floor. And I don't think people know what to do with it, or we're so busy, and everybody's hurting. Or for me also, some of you maybe, you're afraid that you're going to be a burden to people after so long. Like, okay, I'm going to tell you about this really hard thing I'm going through, and I did a terrible job with this, and I'm struggling here, and then next week they see you, how are you doing? Oh, I'm great now. I'm great, because I don't want you to get tired of hearing me just complain about my struggles.
Can I just piggyback on that? I think, just picking up on something you said, I think that there is all of that I totally agree with, but I think there's also, people don't know what to do. You were touched usually by people's suffering to some degree, but then we don't know what to do. And so if a church doesn't have anything to do for my need, then I've shared my need, but nothing's changed. And so that's not where we're supposed to end up. We are supposed to be able to share our needs and our issues and our struggles and our problems and our brokenness and where our family is in pain. But if it sits just right there with, well, that didn't do me a lot of good. Why would I share? Nothing's going to change. So I think we have to get really good and willing to take those next steps of learning what to do, how to help people. And not listening is great. How can we help them? What is there that the church can offer or connect us with? What resource? What something in the community? Or what does the church have? It's like what do we do? And I think that's where many of us don't know. What do you do?
But I think, too, sometimes we're paralyzed. We're paralyzed because we don't know what to do. We won't even be present with people.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the other piece of the puzzle is, at our church, we're a multi-ethnic church, and what ends up happening is like someone comes in and they need help or they need support, and it's like, well, what do I do? I need to do something. It's like, hold on. You don't need to do anything right away because you don't know them. And so let's link, let's take a moment to hear who they are and develop a relationship with them. And as you develop, I do agree that we have to move to action, don't get me wrong, but I think sometimes we're paralyzed because we don't immediately know the next step, that as believers, we don't even know how to hold space for each other. And similar to what she's saying about if I share and it falls flat, how do we say, I hear that? And I can understand by hearing what you're saying that this is extremely hard for you. How can I pray for you? How can I hold space for you right now? Can I come over? And I just think that there are some of those pieces of the puzzle where we're paralyzed because of the ignorance of not knowing what to do, that we don't do anything. And I don't know if that always helps sometimes with people, because some folks, I think a lot of people have resources and things that are given to them, pamphlets, people to call, but some people are just like, I just want to be seen. I want someone to see me struggling and validate that my struggle is real, and that is enough to get me to the next stop sometimes.
I totally agree. Gotta have that compassionate, loving heart.
And bouncing off of both of those things, I think you're right, Kay. I don't think we know what to do, right? If someone comes to us with a broken leg, well, let's go get that fixed, right? So how do we affect change in this area in the church, where parishioners, pastors, ministry leaders know what to do when someone comes to them with a mental health struggle?
Are you asking?
Well, we'll start with you,
Looking at
Kay.
me? Okay.
I'm looking at you. We'll start with you.
Look at it. You ask me? Well, I think the organizations, that are represented here, plus many others, are beginning to grow and beginning to provide some answers to that question of what do we do. And again, I think if a church has to base what they do a lot. There's those crawl steps. There's walk steps. There are things that tiny churches can do. And there's 1,000 things they can't do. And likewise, so it's them doing those, figuring out where you are and what it is your church can do, what training, what connections do you need to have in the community. And then if you're a larger church, taking the responsibility to get more training, to meet together and figure out how can we in our community make a difference. So it's taking the responsibility first, recognizing it's theirs, and then look at where you are, the size of your church, what you can do, and then take those steps. But take them, don't just keep talking about it.
Any other advice from the panel? We can go to the next thing. It's okay.
That's amen.
It's great advice.
Amen.
It's hard to follow that.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to chat about is that there's going to be people who are watching this online or are here today who have been thinking about mental health in the church, but they haven't done anything. They want something in their church to be done, whether it's awareness or programming or connection. What's your advice on how they can do more within their own churches to care for those battling mental health? Let's start with you.
I would say to start with information, training, and breaking stigma. It starts with information, because stigma is when we have an opinion or make a judgment on something that we don't have all the information to make that judgment. And so it starts with having the information and building empathy by sharing stories of people, so sharing stories and sharing facts. And any church can get, basic training, basic information. I mean, we offer it at Anchor International, as do, other organizations here. We have a mental health champions training. Anybody can jump online and take that and get a basic trauma-informed, mental health-informed approach. Leaders, volunteers, people sitting next to you in the pews. So I would say start with that. You don't need to build out an entire mental health ministry, but everybody can be a champion for mental health in their church and be a mental health advocate. And that's where culture starts to shift.
What about you, Laura? What's your big piece of advice? Or small?
Oh, pressure. I think we want to come alongside and do it. I think the experts and the specialists in the room are those with lived experience. And so I think it's really important for churches to see that it's not a them problem, it's an us conversation. And inviting those with lived experience, those who are advocates, parents, family members, to join the conversation and say, what would be valuable for our community? I think that's where I live in Canada, the community and the culture is different from where you live or where you live. And I think it's important not to push or force a square peg in a round hole. We want to hear from the people who are actively involved. And I'm sure many congregations have people like nurses and social workers and therapists and school teachers and those who are working in the field. So I think gathering together the people within your congregation and in your who's connected to your community and say, okay, let's have a conversation. What does this mean for our community, and what are the resources or what are the things that we can do as a church in our local context?
Pastor?
I think a good first step is similar to what Ms. Britt said. I think you do start with a listening party with the folks in your church that have walked through this, and start with just listening to them and documenting what they're sharing, and seeing what bursts organically there, and then from that level, what we've tried to do at our church is we have a listen, learn, and link training where what you could do is you could start with that listening party and then build a local resource map of resources that are accessible to your church or to your people. And you can use that in the process of listening and building a relationship with someone, and use the resources that you have as a first step. But I think I think we glance over this step. We hire consultants, we go on the internet. I think a good first step is to talk to the people in your congregation who've been affected by mental health everywhere on the gamut, and hear the pain points and the joys, the sorrows, and from there develop a organic approach based on what you're hearing. And I think that's every area: youth ministry, young adults, everything. Start with who's there, listen to them first, and then you can adequately know how to hire a consultant to say, this is what I have heard from my people, versus a cookie cutter approach, which I think in mental health awareness specifically is dangerous if you have congregations with specific needs and things. Because there's so many barriers that you don't want to run into issues with.
I think most of you received a packet. It said Hope for Mental Health Community, and that's one of the things where we started was a monthly, you could do it quarterly, you could do it whatever suits your congregation, of gathering of people living with mental illness and their families. We bring in somebody from the community, mental health professionals, so we're giving accurate psychoeducation. But it's a place where if you're there, you look and everybody there is either living with mental illness or is a family member. So you don't have to walk in going, okay, so am I, it's like, no, this is who we are, everybody here. And so we do that monthly. We provide some education, community. It's a place where you feel you're one, you fit, you're part of the larger body of Christ there in our congregation. And we've been doing that since 2019. And it is a wonderful place that people feel, and from there then volunteers, so you build volunteers at the same time. So, and then there's one diagram in there called Partnership in Mental Health Care that shows, it's just a concrete way you can look on your own, of how the faith community has a role to play, a local church, alongside someone who is maybe going through a mental health crisis. So it's this cycle of here's what the church does when somebody's doing well, they start maybe to deteriorate, going to crisis, here's where the church does, but here's what the mental health community does. And so it's a very concrete example of how can we help somebody on their individual mental health journey, and the interplay of the two together, which I think are very concrete steps that anybody could do.
When you mentioned the monthly gathering, one of my first thoughts was still the stigma tied to mental health. How did your church overcome that, where somebody might even be fearful to show up at a monthly meeting?
Yeah, well, we haven't fully, cracked that nut because stigma is huge, but we talk about it. We talk about it from the pulpit. I talk about I've lived with low-level depression my whole life. The fact that we had a son die by suicide kind of put it out there for people to, hey, if Pastor Rick and Kay can have mental illness in their family, then my family isn't so off the charts. So we talk about it openly, and that starts to, I think that's one of those things that, some things in church need to be bottom up. They need to be generated from the bottom up, and other things need to be top down. This feels like one of those top-down things in terms of removing the stigma. There may be people in your congregation who have a passion because it's their family, and so from the bottom up, they're bugging you, Pastor, we need to do this, we need to do this. But the eliminating the stigma is a top-down job, and so from the top down, we have done what we can to dispel both our own stories, have other people tell their stories, normalize it. Oh, that's my Bible study leader. I didn't know he lived with depression. Or that person's in recovery. So that's a top-down responsibility.
I think one of the scary things as a ministry leader sometimes in being vulnerable is that you know that God's people are awesome, but they can be really difficult sometimes.
Yes. They can be mean.
They can be very mean. And when you're vulnerable, they can use that vulnerability as a weapon against you when you're in ministry leadership. What's your word of advice to someone who wants to take that step and share vulnerably as a ministry leader, but is fearful of that being used as a weapon against them?
I think find a different career. No, I think I will say, no. Honestly, it is par for the course. But I also think it's important to realize that vulnerability is not some gift you give to the people you're vulnerable with, but it is your opportunity to be real with yourself about who you are and be okay with that. And so recognizing that all of your vulnerability can be used against you. And that's why people don't want to be vulnerable. And I think that we again, our theological lens impacts this. Jesus was the most vulnerable God, king, priest you will ever find. Died naked on a cross in front of his family, in front of his followers, for nothing, essentially. And I think it's important that we recognize that Jesus, even on the road to the cross, shows us this very clear vulnerability that Jesus said, don't get it wrong. They didn't take my life. I gave it away. I was vulnerable. And I think that's the risk that we take as we serve in ministry. That is the suffering that Christ calls us to, is that even in our attempts to help people heal, there'll be darts thrown and weapons thrown. And I think there you will find that even our pastors need help from the mental health community professionals as well. And so I think it's another circular thing that keeps coming back on itself, but I think that's the risk you take if you want to be healthy in ministry.
I spent 15 years as a clinician supporting individuals in my hometown. And people are people, and people can be mean. And so one of the things that I often encouraged the students who were precepting was plan your day. I know this might be super practical, but make a plan on those days that are hard. And, set yourself up in the morning with intention and have some self-care plan for the evening, debrief with someone. So there are practical steps that you can, as a caregiver, and I think pastors and ministry leaders are on the front line of the caregivers, can do to care for themselves so they don't become weary and burn out. And we often miss that or forget to do that. We forget that we're people too, and we have to care for ourselves, and these things hurt, deeply, deeply hurt when we're wounded by other people who we're just trying to do our best to support. And so I do think there are practical elements in making a plan ahead of time when you know that you're going to be vulnerable. I don't think on a Sunday morning a pastor coming up and saying, this is how I messed up, this is how I'm suffering. I think there's a plan that can be made, and I did not come up with this quote. Someone else said it. If you're in the room, please raise your hand. I have no idea who said this. I talked to too many people. But they said, share from your scars, not your wounds, right? And so when you're talking about being vulnerable, you're not talking about the active, oozy, nasty pieces that still hurt, that if poked and prodded, they're going to hurt you. You're sharing from things that are healed, and that if you poke a scar, it's not going to hurt. And so I think there is some planning and intentionality around when a pastor or how a leader is vulnerable.
I love that. One hard lesson that I've learned about vulnerability, and I'm still learning, is vulnerability is not, for me, just a tell-all, just blabbing, and because I tend to talk a lot. I live with anxiety, and it makes me just talk when I'm nervous, and sometimes way too much. But it's not a tell-all. It's showing up as your authentic self. I think, Brené Brown talks a lot about this. It's being your authentic self. And there are times and places to share those things and to share the wounds with trusted peers, with your trusted group, because not everybody's earned the right to hear your entire story. And that's a lesson, like I said, I'm still learning.
Now, Kay, I have to ask, since you're among all of us in the public eye, your family more than the rest of us, how do you develop that thick skin to be vulnerable when people can be very mean?
I really am just trying to think how to really practically answer that. I feel like, because I'm an introvert I am an introvert and married to Tigger, and Oh, Lord. But so we start, for us, it came out of our marriage was in bad shape right from the beginning. And we were in ministry. He was a youth pastor. And it about killed us, truly. I really thought, Rick ended up in the hospital with depression. I thought I was losing my mind. I sobbed for 60 miles from where I was going to college back to where we lived as a young married couple. We were in ministry, and there was nobody we could tell anything about our lives almost 50 years ago. And it was so painful. And when we felt called to start Saddleback Church after Rick went to seminary, I remember we kind of came out of that going, we are not going back into that box, that prison box of pretending and trying to act like we've got it all together. We don't. It about killed us once. We can't live like that. And so we started Saddleback from a much more vulnerable place. We had the opportunity, starting a church, to start it with a certain level of vulnerability about our lives. And so that has served us well as we have been more in the public eye. It didn't come instantly, it came over time, but it also came out of knowing the opposite of that was a prison we didn't ever want to live in again. But I totally agree with you. There are some parts of your life that need to be shared in the most intimate circles of your most intimate friends. If you're in therapy, whatever, the whole world does not need to know literally everything about you. That's not even healthy for you or the congregation, because they walk out feeling like they got to wipe the off themselves, But you have to have those places of safety and vulnerability. But then living your life, I feel like if you're in ministry, there's a certain level of accepting that you're entitled to a private life, but you're not entitled to private sin. And I don't think mental illness is a sin. I'm just saying you are entitled to some privacy and sharing of your life. But then there's also an acceptance of being in the public eye of, like Paul said, all of 2 Corinthians, follow me as I follow Christ. I share with you myself. My life is committed to God, and as I follow him, follow me. So it's this dance between vulnerability before God, having no secret sin, because you're not entitled to that. But also then, as you said, sharing from the places where God is healing us. It's not like you have to have it all together. You don't, because you never will. So that's the wrong standard to even go for. But to live our lives in such a way that people, hey, listen, I need Jesus to get up in the morning. I need Jesus to get up in the morning. So if my congregation knows they need Jesus to get up in the morning, then it's okay for me to also be in those places where I don't feel so good, but I know I need Jesus, and I don't know, I'm rambling, but.
Can I
very
pick
helpful.
it back
Thank
on
you.
that too? Go ahead. I think Jesus shows us in his ministry that he had these 5 different levels of intimacy where they changed by the group, meaning Jesus has the 5,000 where he does share a level of vulnerability. He seems irritated at the feeding of the 5,000. He seems frustrated. He seems annoyed that the people are not paying attention because they're so hungry. You do get to see a part of Jesus' humanity there, but then you have the 72, where Jesus sends them 2 by 2. Well, he shared with them enough of his life for them to have the courage, the excitement to be able to go out. Then he had the 12, but that's not where it stopped, because even beyond the 12, he joking with them, laughing. But then he has Peter, James, and John, where he takes them to see the most intimate part of himself on the mountain of transfiguration. And then obviously there's him and the Spirit and the Father who get to engage at the most intimate level. So I think you need that as a leader, is you need to create the guardrails that say, this is how I am. When our church got started 3 years ago, I was not prepared to be a pastor. I did not know it until the church started. And sermons needed to be held every week. And my grandmother passed away, my brother passed away, and my sister passed away in that 3-year span. And I had never experienced loss like that. Done funerals, but never experienced my own intimate loss that way. And you're talking about funerals on Friday, Sunday morning is there. And I had to make a decision as a pastor that I wasn't going to sit here and act like I wasn't going through hell while leading them. So I had to be able to say, and this is something I'm still trying to teach myself today. And that's a level of vulnerability. I'm struggling with this. I'm upset with God about this because I don't understand it. But here, I preach the Psalms, but I'm choosing to trust him amidst what I don't understand. And so I think that, and I just had to make that decision. Same thing with my marriage. I wanted people to know that we had a human marriage. I told my church 3 weeks ago that one week, my wife asked me if she could get her own apartment on a Monday, and on a Wednesday, we were planning our vow renewal. I'm like, church, my marriage is like, we got the same problems you have. My wife is like, I think I could do this without you. And I'm like, I think that's a good idea. And Wednesday, we're like, we don't know what we would do without each other. And so I think it's important. And a member asked me, like, is your wife okay when you share those things? And I'm like, I don't know. But what I'm trying to tell the church is, I don't want you to think that we're someone we're not. And I want you to pray for me. I want you to know that I am struggling too. And I want you to be able to say, let me pray for Pastor Keon. He mentioned that this is a hard season for him right now. So let me be in prayer for them. Let me take a meal over there. I want the church to be able to love me while I'm trying to carry this banner. And I think that's the gift of vulnerability. And by all means, use wisdom. You use wisdom. I didn't tell him about the text message she sent me before church. I don't tell everything. You got to use wisdom. You don't want to hurt people with your story, but you do want to be able to throw out the branch that says, I'm here. Yeah, me too. I'm here with you. I'm wrestling with that too.
Please join me in thanking our panelists today. I'm going to invite Catherine up. And you want us to sit down or stay up? What's best for you, Catherine? Whatever you'd like to do.